The first snows came quietly to the Russian steppe, drifting over the endless plains like a ghost returning home. At first, the German soldiers thought it beautiful, a thin white veil softening the harsh brown earth, dusting the blackened wrecks of villages in the fields beyond. Officers stood beside their panzers, smoking and laughing, their breath turning to mist. Winter, they said, is nothing to the German army. They believed discipline and machinery could conquer anything, even the cold. But that belief would soon die, just as their engines would, frozen solid beneath the open sky. In the autumn of 1941, Operation Barbarossa was supposed to have already ended in victory. The Wehrmacht had stormed across the Soviet Union with breathtaking speed. Thousands of tanks, millions of men, hundreds of miles gained in weeks. Entire Soviet armies had been encircled, destroyed, or captured. The propaganda in Berlin spoke of triumph, of unstoppable momentum. Moscow was said to be within reach. Many German generals privately believed the war in the East would be finished by Christmas. But by November, the front had changed. The roads turned to mud, deep and clinging, swallowing trucks whole. Tanks struggled to move, their tracks caked with frozen soil. Ammunition convoys stalled for days. The rapid advance that had once defined the Blitzkrieg slowed to a crawl. Supplies dwindled. Soldiers began tearing insulation from destroyed houses to line their coats. Temperatures dropped lower than any of them had ever felt. -20, then -30, then lower still. German officers sent urgent requests for winter clothing to headquarters. The response came late and thin. Hitler's high command had expected victory before the freeze and had not prepared for long campaigns in sub-zero conditions. Wool coats, gloves, and boots were in short supply. Many soldiers wrapped rags around their feet, their breath freezing into crystals on their faces. The laughter that once greeted the snow faded into silence. The tanks, symbols of Germany's might, began to die first. Their engines, designed for Western Europe's mild climate, thickened with oil that congealed like glue. Crews woke before dawn to light fires beneath their panzers, hoping to warm the machinery enough to start it. Sometimes it worked. More often, it didn't. Batteries froze. Metal cracked. Hydraulic systems stiffened. Once powerful armored divisions found themselves stranded. Cold, blind, and immobile. Soviet scouts watched from the forests, their breath hidden in scarves of frost. They knew what was coming. The Russian winter was their oldest ally, and it had chosen its side. The laughter that had echoed across the plains in October had vanished by December. In its place came the groan of engines dying in the cold, the cracking of steel under frost, and the low, distant thunder of an army realizing that nature itself had turned against them. By December 1941, the German advance toward Moscow had slowed to a desperate crawl. The once proud spearheads of the Wehrmacht, the armored divisions that had conquered Europe, now sat motionless in the snow. The roads were gone, buried under layers of ice and wind-driven frost. Horses, frozen where they stood, marked the paths that once led east. Trucks lay half-buried, their tires splitting from the cold. The world had turned white and silent, and the German army was dying within it. Soldiers woke to find their rifles frozen to their hands, their breath freezing the moment it left their lips. Fires offered little comfort. The fuel itself sometimes refused to ignite. Frostbites spread like an invisible enemy, claiming fingers, noses, and ears. Men who had survived artillery and bullets now collapsed in their sleep, their hearts slowed by the cold until they stopped completely. Entire regiments disappeared, not through battle, but through exposure. Inside the tanks, the situation was worse. The panzers that had led the charge into Russia, Panzer IIIs, IVs, and the heavier command tanks, had become useless hulks. Oil turned to paste inside their engines, radiators burst, and turrets froze in place. Even the fuel was treacherous, thickening into sludge before it reached the engines. Mechanics used blowtorches and small fires to coax life into the machinery, but as soon as the warmth faded, everything stiffened again. The Soviets, however, were not idle. Their own forces, battered and bloodied through months of retreat, had learned to fight the winter as well as the invaders. Their tanks, the rugged T-34s, performed like beasts in the cold. their wide tracks and diesel engines built for the Russian steppe. They moved through snowdrifts that stopped German vehicles in their tracks. Soviet infantry wore fur-lined coats, felt boots, and scarves. They blended into the frozen forests like the winter itself. When the counter-offensive began in early December, it struck like a storm. Red Army divisions, fresh from Siberia, swept down upon the frozen German lines. They moved quickly, relentlessly, in temperatures that plunged below minus 40 degrees Celsius. The Wehrmacht's overextended front began to splinter. Tanks that could not start were abandoned. Guns froze solid. Ammunition cracked in its casings. In villages outside Moscow, the fighting became surreal. German soldiers fought from inside half-frozen buildings, firing through shattered windows while snow poured through the roofs. They could see their enemy only as shadows moving between gusts of snow. Every shot, every breath, was a struggle against the elements as much as against the opposing army. Generals in Berlin still demanded advances, still spoke of decisive victory, but at the front there was no talk of glory. There was only survival. Reports from the Eastern Front grew grim. Entire divisions had lost half their men without firing a shot. Supply lines were broken and the railroads frozen. The once invincible army that had rolled across Europe was now trapped in an icy grave. The laughter of autumn had become a memory, a sound that no one dared repeat. In its place came the wind, howling through the empty fields, carrying the sound of an empire's first great defeat. The German army that had once seemed unstoppable was now unrecognizable. The proud ranks of soldiers who had marched east beneath banners of victory were reduced to hollow-eyed figures wrapped in scavenged furs, their breath frozen to their faces, their movements slow and uncertain. Even the officers who once carried themselves with the arrogance of conquest now moved through the snow like ghosts. The front had swallowed them, not in battle, but in cold and silence. Every morning began the same. Fires were built from the wreckage of carts, furniture, or anything that would burn. Men crowded around them, holding out trembling hands that could barely feel. The crackle of flame was their only comfort, and even that sound was fragile, quickly lost in the moan of the wind. Food was scarce. Water had to be hacked from blocks of ice and boiled over whatever heat could be found. The tanks stood useless across the fields, hundreds of them, dark against the white. Crews slept inside their steel coffins, trying to capture what little warmth their bodies could produce. But the cold was patient. It crept through armor plating and froze the oil in the joints, split the rubber seals, and shattered the glass of viewing ports. Mechanics stripped the engines bare, replacing parts that broke the moment they were touched. They lit small fires under the hulls, feeding them with wood and rags soaked in fuel, praying the heat would wake the machines again. But the temperature kept falling. The fires grew smaller. The engines remained dead. When Soviet artillery began to thunder across the front, the frozen tanks became traps. German soldiers huddled beside them for cover, but when shells struck, the brittle steel cracked instead of bending. The explosions sent shards of frozen metal scything through the snow, killing men who never saw the enemy that fired them. In contrast, Soviet armor rolled forward with grim efficiency. The T-34s and KV-1s advanced through the storm, their tracks grinding effortlessly over ice and snow. They were built for this. Their engines breathed diesel that never froze, their crews insulated in sheepskin and wool. They closed in on the stranded German divisions like hunters circling prey. Commanders tried to form defensive lines, but communication broke down. Radios froze. Wires snapped. Orders issued from Berlin meant nothing when fuel would not burn and tanks would not move. Some units fought on stubbornly, holding villages and crossroads until the last shell was fired, the last rifle cracked in the frost. Others simply vanished into the snow. The myth of German invincibility, the machine that had conquered Europe in a single year, was crumbling before an enemy it could not shoot. The Soviets called it General Frost. The Germans called it bad luck. But it was neither. It was nature's reckoning, centuries in the making. And in the heart of that frozen battlefield, amid the dead engines and shattered steel, the laughter that once echoed so proudly in the autumn air had been replaced by something far colder. silence. The winter of 1941 to 42 became a legend for its cruelty. Temperatures plunged lower than anything recorded in living memory, reaching minus 40 degrees in some regions. The snow never stopped falling. It covered roads, fields, even corpses, erasing the outlines of armies. What had once been the spearhead of the Wehrmacht was now a frozen monument to arrogance. Tens of thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, trapped in a world turned white. In the villages and forests around Moscow, German soldiers scavenged for survival. They tore curtains from windows to wrap around their legs, stripped dead horses of their hides for warmth, melted snow in helmets for drinking water. Every building that could burn was reduced to ash. The front lines blurred, not through retreat or advance, but because the living could no longer tell where one side ended and the other began. Inside the panzers, crews fought two enemies at once, the Red Army and the cold itself. Lubricants thickened into wax, gears jammed, machine guns refused to fire. The smell of frozen oil and metal hung heavy in the air. At night, men took turns sleeping beside tiny stoves made from ammunition boxes, their breath frosting the walls. Some awoke to find the man beside them, still and pale, his body stiff as the steel he slept against. Yet despite the misery, German high command continued to issue impossible orders. Hitler demanded that no step backward be taken, that every position be held to the last man. But the last man was often gone before the command reached him. The generals at the front, men like Guderian and von Kluge, begged for permission to retreat, to regroup, to live. Their requests were denied. The Führer believed that sheer willpower could defy the Russian winter. The truth was that willpower froze as easily as blood. Meanwhile, the Red Army pressed forward. Siberian divisions, hardened by years of survival in the cold, poured into the fight. They struck swiftly, striking at the weakest points in the German line. Places where the tanks had died and the infantry could no longer move. Their white uniforms blended perfectly with the snow, making them nearly invisible until it was too late. At night, the sky flashed orange as villages burned, their wooden frames collapsing into glowing embers. The Soviets had learned to use the cold as a weapon. They struck, vanished into the snow, and returned again hours later. Every attack seemed to come from the blizzard itself. The once proud columns of the Wehrmacht began to fracture. Supply trucks froze solid, horses collapsed in the drifts. Entire units cut off from command, huddled together in barns and trenches, hoping for dawn that brought no warmth. Some soldiers broke open the fuel tanks of dead tanks, using the gasoline for warmth despite the risk of explosion. By January, the German offensive toward Moscow had completely failed. What remained of the army was no longer advancing, but merely trying to survive. The laughter of the summer, the confidence that had carried them across Europe, was gone. The same snow that had once seemed harmless now buried entire divisions beneath it. The same generals who had laughed at the idea of a Russian winter now watched their machines die one by one, their soldiers vanish into the frost, and the dream of victory freeze into silence. By the first weeks of 1942, the front near Moscow had become a wasteland of frozen iron and bone. The roads that had carried Hitler's legions eastward were now littered with wrecks, tanks half buried in snowdrifts, their turrets tilted skyward, their once gleaming armor dulled to a gray crust of frost. Dead horses and shattered carts lined the trails, their outlines softened by wind and snow. The war machine that had once seemed unstoppable now sat motionless, silent except for the groaning of metal contracting in the cold. The German high command still clung to its illusions. Reports to Berlin spoke of temporary setbacks, of difficult weather conditions. But in the trenches and forests, soldiers no longer used words like setback. They spoke only of endurance, how long a man could survive without sleep, without food, without warmth. Many no longer bothered to count the days. The front was a frozen purgatory where time itself seemed to have stopped. Rations had run thin. Supply convoys rarely arrived. When they did, the food was frozen solid and the fuel too thick to burn. Soldiers hammered holes in ice to cook, burning fragments of wooden crates or scraps of furniture to heat their meager meals. Bread was as hard as stone. Meat, when it existed, had to be hacked apart with bayonets. Hunger gnawed at discipline faster than bullets could. The tanks, the pride of the German army, had become monuments to hubris. Crews abandoned them one by one, marking the hatches with chalk crosses to warn others of frozen corpses inside. Mechanics who tried to restart the engines often lost their fingers to frostbite before they could even reach the spark plugs. The once polished machines of Blitzkrieg had become dark tombs in the snow, and still the Red Army advanced. The Soviets moved through the blizzards like phantoms, their white camouflage merging with the landscape. Their weapons worked in the cold. Their supply lines, though strained, held. They had learned from their past defeats, and now they fought on home soil in conditions that were their inheritance. They didn't just fight the Germans, they let the winter fight with them. From the air, Soviet aircraft strafed the stalled convoys, scattering what few supplies the Germans still possessed. Bombs fell on immobilized tank parks, sending fire rolling across the ice. The flashes of explosion were brief, their echoes lost quickly to the howling wind. When the smoke cleared, the snow fell again, covering everything, hiding the ruins under a fresh white shroud. Even communication was breaking down. Radio batteries froze. Telephones stopped working. Commands were delayed for days, sometimes never reaching the units that needed them. The Wehrmacht had entered the Soviet Union as a perfectly synchronized machine. Now it was a scattered collection of isolated groups, each fighting for survival in their own pocket of frozen hell. For the men at the front, hope had shrunk to the smallest things. A piece of firewood, a dry pair of socks, a single cigarette. The dreams of conquest that had once driven them east were gone, replaced by one desperate thought: to see spring again. But spring was still far away, and the winter showed no mercy. The snow fell harder, the winds grew sharper, and the panzers, the very symbols of German might, rusted quietly into the frozen ground. Their guns pointed uselessly at the indifferent sky. By February 1942, the German front in Russia was collapsing not from enemy fire, but from the sheer brutality of the winter itself. The cold no longer felt like weather. It was an enemy, one that struck everywhere at once. It seized weapons, froze flesh, shattered steel, and silenced engines. It surrounded entire divisions and devoured them without a shot being fired. The landscape had become an endless graveyard. Along the frozen highways, the wrecks of panzers stood in rows like tombstones. Their engines were split open, their metal brittle and sharp, snow filling their interiors like burial shrouds. The famed armor that had rolled across Europe was now motionless, consumed by the same cold arrogance that had sent it east without winter oil, antifreeze, or insulation. The soldiers who survived called it Der Weiße Tod, the White Death. It was everywhere. Frostbite turned hands black and useless. Men lost their ears, their feet, their ability to stand. Ammunition belts cracked when flexed. Bolts snapped clean off rifles. The most experienced snipers could not pull their triggers without first warming them in their mouths. The retreat toward the west began slowly, more a disintegration than an organized withdrawal. Entire units vanished. Others staggered backward through waist-deep snow, their boots wrapped in rags, dragging wounded comrades on sleds made from doors. Orders from Berlin were meaningless now. No one cared about Moscow anymore. They only cared about getting out alive. But the Soviets did not let them go easily. The Red Army pressed forward with renewed strength. Siberian troops, veterans of climates even harsher than this, attacked at dawn and dusk when the cold was worst. They wore white cloaks and moved soundlessly across the snow. Soviet tanks, the T-34s, churned through the drifts, their engines roaring, their treads spitting up clouds of frozen dust. They struck with precision, hitting stranded German formations that couldn't maneuver or escape. When German commanders tried to counterattack, their own tanks refused to start. Mechanics resorted to desperate measures, lighting fires under engines, mixing alcohol with fuel, urinating into gearboxes to thaw them. Nothing worked for long. The machines that had symbolized German modernity had been undone by nature itself. The reports reaching Berlin were grim. Losses mounted not in hundreds, but in tens of thousands. Frozen to death. Equipment destroyed by cold. Horses dead. Trucks abandoned. Hitler refused to believe it. From his headquarters, he ranted that the generals were weak. that his soldiers lacked faith. But faith could not turn frozen engines or feed starving men. In some sectors, the Soviets recaptured ground the Germans had taken only months earlier. The villages the Wehrmacht had seized with pride in summer were now being retaken one by one, their ruins swallowed by snow. German soldiers stumbled through streets they no longer recognized, past the skeletons of tanks that had once carried them forward. There was no victory left to chase, only endurance. The dream of a swift conquest had frozen along with the oil in the Panzer's lines. What remained was survival against an enemy that never slept, never bled, and never retreated. The cold had proven itself a weapon sharper than any blade, and it was winning. By March 1942, the Russian winter had finished what no army had ever done before. It had broken the German Wehrmacht. The front line was no longer a line at all, but a scattered patchwork of frozen positions, each fighting its own war against the elements. The once perfect machine of Blitzkrieg lay shattered beneath the snowdrifts, its gears jammed, its engines cracked, its soldiers reduced to shadows of the proud invaders they had once been. When the thaw finally began, it brought no relief. The snow melted into thick, endless mud that swallowed the wreckage whole. The same roads that had once been dust in summer and ice in winter were now rivers of filth. Tanks, trucks, and bodies slowly sank into the mire. The landscape smelled of rust, oil, and decay. The war for a time stood still, frozen by the season, dissolved by the mud. The survivors of the German army had seen what pride and planning could not overcome. They had seen their finest weapons fail, their logistics collapse, and their command refuse to acknowledge the truth. For months they had been told that Moscow was within reach, but now standing knee-deep in ice and mud, they understood that the city had never been the enemy. The enemy had been the cold itself, and it had destroyed them. Soldiers wrote home on scraps of frozen paper, describing the horrors they dared not speak aloud. They wrote of comrades who froze sitting upright, of boots fused to their feet, of engines that shattered like glass. They wrote of the silence, how after a bombardment or an ambush, all sounds seemed to vanish, leaving only the wind moving through the wrecks. Some never sent their letters. They froze in their pockets, unread and unfinished. The Soviets, meanwhile, pressed forward relentlessly. They reclaimed hundreds of villages, pushing the Germans west. Their soldiers, hardened by years of struggle and by the same cold that had killed so many, fought with renewed confidence. They saw that the invincible enemy could be broken, not by numbers or firepower alone, but by endurance. The balance of the war had shifted, though few understood it at the time. Back in Berlin, Hitler still spoke of victory. He refused to allow retreats, refused to believe the reports that described panzers frozen solid and divisions reduced to a fraction of their strength. He blamed his generals, sacked commanders, and issued orders that could no longer be obeyed. His vision of domination, of unstoppable German steel, had collided with a truth older and colder than his ambition. The myth of Blitzkrieg was dead. The tank that had been the symbol of German power now sat rusting in the fields of Russia, half buried under ice and ash. The same generals who had once laughed at warnings of the Russian winter now buried their soldiers beneath it. As the snow retreated, it revealed what the cold had hidden: the bones of men and machines, twisted together in the mud. The laughter of summer, the confidence of the campaign's first days, had vanished. All that remained was the grim knowledge that no army, no matter how advanced, could conquer the Russian winter. The front was not yet lost, but the illusion of invincibility was gone forever. And in that loss, the tide of the Second World War quietly began to turn. By the time spring approached, the Eastern Front had transformed from a battlefield into a graveyard of machines. As the snow thawed, the ground released what it had held in its icy grip for months: twisted metal, shattered helmets, and the lifeless bodies of soldiers caught in their final moments. The once mighty German war machine, built on precision and speed, lay corroding in the mud, its engines drowned in water and rust. The retreat from Moscow had begun in earnest, though few called it that. Official reports spoke of strategic withdrawals, but everyone at the front knew what it meant. The great invasion had failed. The same generals who had once boasted that the campaign would last only weeks now, fought to save what was left of their armies. Columns of frostbitten men shuffled westward through villages reduced to ash, leaving behind thousands of wrecked tanks and vehicles that would never move again. The Russian countryside had exacted its revenge. The forests were littered with broken trucks and collapsed wagons, their wheels frozen in place. Abandoned panzers stood like monuments, their armor cracked from the cold. Horses lay where they had fallen, their skeletons already showing through the thawing ice. Each one was a marker of how far Germany's reach had exceeded its grasp. As the temperature rose, a new misery set in. The thaw turned the steppe into an ocean of mud so deep that boots and wheels sank without trace. Trucks stalled, tanks that had survived the winter now bogged down to their turrets. The Germans had mastered the science of war, but they could not master the land itself. The Russian soil swallowed everything. Meanwhile, the Red Army pressed on. What had begun as a desperate defense had turned into a relentless counteroffensive. Soviet units advanced through the wreckage of the German front, using captured equipment where they could, burning what they couldn't carry. For the first time since the invasion began, they had momentum and morale. They no longer feared the German panzers. They had watched them freeze, stall, and die. They had seen the invincible army reduced to scavenging for warmth. The Wehrmacht's supply line, stretched across hundreds of miles, were in ruins. Fuel was gone. Ammunition was short. Even communication had collapsed. Orders from Berlin were weeks late, often meaningless by the time they arrived. Entire divisions were cut off, their survivors wandering through the snow, trying to find friendly lines that no longer existed. And still Hitler refused to see reason. In his headquarters far from the front, he spoke of regrouping, of breaking the Soviet spirit. But the spirit that had been broken was his own armies, frozen, starved, and exhausted. The generals who returned from Russia carried the truth in their eyes. The dream of conquering the East had died in the snow. The winter of 1941-42 became a turning point in history, though few realized it at the time. For the first time, the German war machine had been stopped. The same generals who once scoffed at the idea of defeat now understood that their empire was mortal. The laughter that had echoed in the summer sun of 1941 had been buried beneath ice and silence. The German army had not been defeated by strategy or numbers, but by the same force that had protected Russia for centuries: its winter. Nature had done what no army could. It had turned steel brittle, frozen oil, broken men's hearts, and swallowed an empire whole. When spring finally arrived in full, the Eastern Front revealed the true scale of the disaster. As the snow and ice receded, the frozen stillness gave way to decay. The landscape was littered with the remnants of the once invincible Wehrmacht. Blackened tanks half submerged in water, trucks collapsed under their own weight, rifles rusting in the thawing fields. Roads turned to rivers of mud and oil. Everywhere, the traces of an army that had believed itself unstoppable now lay scattered and broken. The German soldiers who survived the winter staggered through the ruins of their own advance. Their uniforms were in tatters, their boots soaked through, their weapons unreliable. Their faces were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and aged beyond their years. The frostbite scars never healed. The laughter that had carried them across Europe had been replaced by silence. The silence of men who had learned that even steel could die. Everywhere they looked, reminders of hubris stood stark against the thaw. Panzers with engines torn open, their mechanics' fires still blackened on the ground beneath them. Frozen convoys stretching across empty plains, vehicles mired in ice and mud where they had stopped months before. Ammunition crates split apart, shells scattered like seeds across the earth. The illusion of order, the machine-like precision of blitzkrieg, had disintegrated into chaos. The Soviets pressed their advantage, slow and deliberate, reclaiming village after village. Their soldiers were hardened, moving through the wreckage with quiet purpose. The Red Army had not only survived the winter, it had been reborn by it. For the first time, its commanders no longer fought merely to survive, but to win. The myth of German invincibility was gone, replaced by the grim determination of revenge. For the Germans, retreat offered no safety. Supply lines were broken, bridges destroyed, and the thawing rivers carried away anything that could float. Trucks drowned in the mud, and the tanks that once ruled the battlefield became traps for the men who tried to use them. In many sectors, the withdrawal turned into a rout. Soldiers left behind their weapons, their wounded, even their comrades' bodies. They no longer marched. They trudged westward through filth and exhaustion, following the faint hope of warmth. Reports filtered back to Berlin, each one more desperate than the last. Entire divisions reduced to skeleton forces, tens of thousands dead not from combat, but from cold and hunger. Hitler dismissed it as weakness, claiming the men lacked faith in the Reich. But no ideology could fight frostbite, no propaganda could thaw an engine, and no speech could restore the dead. The truth had frozen itself into history. Germany's greatest army had met an enemy it could not defeat. As the months passed, the front stabilized, but the balance had changed forever. The German army, once feared across the world, had been humbled. Its aura of unstoppable strength had cracked in the cold, and the world had seen it. What began as a campaign of conquest had ended as a struggle for survival. The laughter of the generals, the confidence of the summer briefings, the certainty of victory, all had vanished into the snow. In their place stood a grim new reality. The war in the East would not end quickly. The Soviet Union had endured, and now the Reich would face a long, grinding reckoning. The panzers that had once symbolized German pride were now silent monuments to folly, scattered across a continent they had failed to conquer. And though the snow had melted, the memory of their defeat would remain frozen forever. By summer 1942, the fields that had buried Germany's armies in snow were green again. The frozen tanks had thawed, their blackened hulls now surrounded by tall grass and buzzing flies. Nature had reclaimed what war had abandoned. To the untrained eye, the land seemed peaceful, but beneath the surface lay rusted steel, bones, and silence. The scars of winter had not healed. They had only been covered. The Wehrmacht rebuilt itself as best it could. New tanks arrived, new recruits filled the ranks, and the propaganda in Berlin once again promised victory. But the men who had survived the winter knew better. They remembered the sound of engines refusing to turn, the endless wind, the comrades who froze beside them. No new machine, no confident speech could erase the memory of the snow that had devoured an army. They followed orders, but the light that once burned in their eyes was gone. That winter had taught a lesson older than any strategy. The Eastern Front was not a battlefield to be conquered. It was a living thing, vast and merciless, and it chose who survived. The Germans had believed that discipline and technology could overcome nature, that their engines could outrun the cold. But in Russia, nature was not an obstacle. It was an opponent. The same frost that turned rivers into roads also shattered the steel of tanks. The same snow that softened the sound of boots also buried entire divisions. Soviet soldiers, hardened by the same elements that had destroyed their enemies, marched east to west now. Their morale was high, their factories alive, their confidence growing. For them, winter was not an enemy, it was an ally. They had endured what others could not, and endurance had become their weapon. In the ruined villages left behind, wrecks of German vehicles still dotted the landscape. Children climbed inside them, playing in the shells of panzers that had once carried fear across continents. Farmers plowed around them, their fields growing over the remnants of invasion. The land remembered what the world wanted to forget, that arrogance had a cost, and that no empire, however modern or mighty, could outlast the cold. For the generals who had once laughed at the warnings of the Russian winter, the memory lingered like frost that never melted. They had trusted steel over soil, precision over patience, willpower over weather. But in the end, the simplest force, the temperature of the air, had undone the most complex war machine ever built. The laughter that once echoed in the briefing rooms of summer 1941 had frozen to silence long before the first tank engine failed. The German army would rise again for new offensives, toward Stalingrad, toward the Caucasus, but it would never be the same. The myth of invincibility had died in the snow outside Moscow, buried beneath a white horizon that stretched farther than any map. The world had watched an empire meet its limit, not at the hands of another nation, but in the face of nature itself. And as the years passed, the story of that winter became legend, whispered by survivors, studied by generals, and remembered by those who understood what arrogance can cost. The tanks that once roared with confidence now slept beneath rust and moss, their guns pointing uselessly at the sky. In the end, the winter had not just stopped an army, it had broken a belief. The belief that man's machines could master the world. The cold had no ideology, no mercy, no need for glory. It simply waited. And when the laughter began, it froze it in place forever. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.